DX. They help hundreds of the most thought-leading companies, both in tech and non-tech, thinking about developer experience and developer productivity. And there are very few companies out there that has a better vantage point on what's actually happening, I think, on the front line of tooling and productivity and developer more broadly. DX, you're just working with like the likes of the Pfizers, the Netflix, the Dropboxes of the world, probably a couple of the people out in the room here. And Abhi and team is also comprised of some really thought-leading researchers. So both Margaret and Nicole, creators of Dora and space frameworks and metrics around that, work with you and your team on the research side. And so this is, like, for me, one of the most exciting conversations, obviously, since I raised my hand to do this, because I think it's top of mind for everyone here today. And most organizations, most leaders, everybody in this room, are thinking about AI and AI in the context of developer productivity. And so really, wanted to discuss that with you a little bit, try to understand what's real, where are we today, what should people be expecting when they go home. The hype cycle is real, so I think a lot of people are like stressing out about like, hey, am I effective? Are we doing the right things? There's top-down mandates and pressures. So maybe we can dive in on this. And then as a board member and an investor, I also think a lot about this when I look at budgets and resources being allocated to R&D. It's very often the second largest sort of category, or if not the single largest category in a lot of the companies that we work with, as far as like allocating dollars to hiring employees and whatnot. And so, maybe you can describe a little bit about how DX helps and the journey so far.
Yeah, we work with just under 400 companies, helping them measure developer productivity and experience. And this is a transformative moment where everyone is asking questions about how is AI impacting developer productivity? How do we pick the right tools? How do we enable our developers to upskill and adjust and make this shift? So front row seat into many organizations that are navigating this and putting a lot of resources toward really understanding how to make this shift rapidly.
Right. So obviously we're here in San Francisco, probably the epicenter of the hype, and so it's hard to kind of sometimes parse out what's real and what's truly happening. But from your point of view, where are we today relative to the promise of AI?
Yeah, I think the slogan, the soundbite would be, it's a tool right now. It's not completely transforming the way we're seeing organizations operate efficiently in engineering, at least, right? When we look at the numbers, we see a lot of positive effects on throughput, on self-reported time savings, on efficiency, but those numbers aren't to the level of what we see in the press, right? We saw Google come out this week with that 10% number. That aligns much more closely to what we see in the real data from organizations than the 30, 50% numbers, recently coming out of Microsoft, for example. So yeah, I think, and it's still early days. Yeah. So we see a really positive trend upward. So that's not to say there's that enormous promise, but a lot of leaders today are struggling with reconciling the immense expectations from CEOs and CFOs with the reality that they see in their organizations with their developers. So that's a challenge right now.
Yeah, and maybe how has sort of like the way that you thought about your business and engaging with customers evolved as this is happening? Maybe like when people were thinking about this, a lot of people were thinking about like 30% productivity early on. What has maybe made that number go up or down? And is it kind of like the completeness? Are they finding new metrics? Or is it sort of like the old PR throughputs and whatnot?
Yeah, there's some old and some new, right? I mean, I get asked all kinds of, I get asked, should we even be measuring developer productivity anymore in this new world? And I think, so, some things that are the same, right? Measuring your organizational effectiveness in software engineering and productivity is as important as ever, because that's really your control variable to understand what's the impact as we bring in these new tools. It's important to have that baseline. What's new is that because the nature of software engineering is changing, the way we measure also needs to evolve. So we need to have new ways of thinking about measuring agents. I heard in the last panel that's a word to avoid. Agentic tools and assistants, right? The way we measure the success of these tools is different than the way we've measured people and teams previously.
Can you remind us a little bit what we used to measure and how that plays into where you think we were heading?
Yeah, so like traditional measures of engineering throughput, quality, defect rates, these things still matter, right? I mean, this is ultimately still like the output of a software engineering organization is like the software you deliver. So it's important to measure that. It's also still important to measure the human aspect of software engineering, so developer experience, qualitative aspects. But what's different is that things like lines of code, for example, right? When you can generate thousands, hundreds of thousands of lines of code in a tab, certain types of output measures like that are less relevant. And then we also need to think about, okay, as we bring in more agents, into the SDLC, as we add AI tools, how do we really understand the ROI? How do we know, which tool is the right investment? So those are new questions that we have to answer.
Yeah. I know you're about to publish your DX kind of evolved framework, and that obviously is informed by the research that you and your team has been performing. And what maybe is some of the guidance and changes that maybe this audience can internalize a little bit and bring home?
Yeah, what we've seen with the companies we work with is there, many of them are evaluating dozens of AI engineering tools at once, right? They're evaluating everything. And so it's really important to understand, one, how are the ways we understand which tools are working more effectively than others? How do we identify the use cases that are most valuable in our organization? And then how do we reconcile that with cost, which is an increasingly important topic people are starting to talk about? Ultimately, how do we make sure the ROI from this tool is actually as exciting as the promise of it? And so, we created this framework out of both our research and practical experience with a lot of different companies, really helping them along various points of that journey. So, this framework spans utilization, impact, and cost. That's really the way we see organizations navigating this shift. First, focusing on, hey, let's get these tools in the hands of developers. Let's encourage them, give them opportunity to use them, learn how to incorporate them. Then let's think about, okay, how do we actually get a lot of impact and value from these tools? What are the use cases in your organization where developers can gain a lot of leverage from these tools? Then lastly, okay, how much are we paying? And how do we kind of bring in governance, standardization, and how we're deploying these tools? So this really kind of mirrors the adoption journey that we see organizations taking.
Very, very cool. I don't know if you're prepared to talk a little bit about somebody out there that you feel is doing a good job of managing both the hype, but also the reality of bringing the organization forward?
Yeah, I wasn't prepared, but I can speak to that. So one of our customers, Booking.com, right, about 3,500 engineers based in Amsterdam. They've gone through, I think, what is the prototypical journey here, which is enormous top-down pressure around, hey, where's our 30% productivity, 50% productivity gain? Early in their journey, they went out and brought in some different AI code assistant tools, had a lot of difficulty actually getting developers to roll them out. One of the things they had to do initially was bring developers and leaders onto the same page about what this tool could actually do in the organization. So they used DX to capture measurements on what type of productivity gains, utilization they were seeing across the organization. And that allowed them to manage expectations with leadership, but also encourage developers who were previously skeptical about using these tools. So that's how they kind of transcended that adoption gap. From there, they've been really focused now on impact. They saw here certain use cases, certain levels of utilization correlated with much higher levels of productivity for their developers. So again, they're using data to help encourage developers and make the business case internally to developers that, hey, this is something you should adopt and think about adding to your workflow.
Very cool. And did they appoint specific people in the organization to lead the charge or kind of be spearheading some of these initiatives? Was it a top-down mandate, as you suggested, and people kind of went rogue and experienced on their own?
Yeah.
What guided them through this kind of more?
So they didn't do a top-down mandate.
Yep.
We are seeing a lot of that in the industry, but it was top-down pressure,
Sure.
more at the engineering leadership level. And it was really their head of engineering infrastructure, head of developer productivity that was spearheading the rollout of these tools. So they were under pressure to really reconcile the expectations of leaders with the needs and success of developers.
Did they have a baseline in place?
They did,
Yeah.
yeah. So they used that baseline to show with their early cohorts of people who were trialing some of these tools the impact it could have. And they used that data to go to the skeptics and say, hey, it's worth giving it a chance.
Makes sense. Do you see any difference in the efficacy or the behavior depending on size of organization, industries, regulated, non-regulated? That's worthwhile to kind of highlight at this stage.
Yeah, empirically, we see organizations with larger, older code bases at sort of expressing a systemic disadvantage to companies with more modern, less monolithic, more services-oriented architectures. That's a conversation I've been having with a lot of organizations. That, ultimately with these tools, right, their ability to understand and grok and manipulate the code base, no different than a human, is ultimately what influences your success with these tools. And so there's a lot of talk right now about how can you actually re-architect your systems for optimal agent code maintainability in the same way that I think we think about code quality from a human readability standpoint. So I think that's a really interesting thing that's not talked about a lot right now, but is a systemic factor in your ability to get leverage out of these tools.
Yeah, awesome. Maybe go back a little bit to that Google paper and the 10%. What changed in people's narrative? Is it more of a longitudinal point of view about the quality and sort of the ability for people to actually run with the code and maybe interpret it from a failure rate perspective and whatnot? Because I think for a while we all thought we could get 25, 30% improvement. And
yeah, so a lot of the numbers in the press are kind of cherry-picked numbers that are spun given a marketing spin, so it's a little challenging to interpret them. But typically, a lot of the numbers you see, 50%, 60% improvement, are isolated, controlled experiments, right? They're controlled scientific experiments where developers are given a really specific task, and then in a lab, and they're able to complete that task X percentage faster. The other number you hear in the press is AI code generated. So Satya came out and said 30% code at Microsoft is AI generated. That number is generally referring to the amount of lines of code accepted, suggestions accepted, which doesn't account for the fact that, even if you don't write code, if you just use AI for writing, right, you splatter a bunch of words on the page with AI, and then you go back and edit and delete a lot of it. Yeah. So it's not really
doesn't say anything about the ROI.
Exactly.
Or anything like this either, right?
And so, ultimately, I think Google's number is the first, one of the first large-scale company coming out and saying here's a rational way of actually measuring the impact, and here's what we're seeing, which is 10%. And they are measuring time savings for developers using logs-based data. So really looking at the developer activity data to then approximate time savings, which is similar to some of the approaches we use.
Yeah. Of course, right now we're talking a lot about AI augmented code generation, right? But a developer spends 25, 30% of his or her time writing code. Yeah. And do you see kind of where's the friction maybe outside of those systems and sort of the IDE and what are people maybe doing to incorporate maybe higher throughput on actual code, but not necessarily the systems in and around that?
Yeah, so people talk about inner loop and outer loop in software development. And right now, these AI tools are very much, I think, making an impact on the inner loop of writing code, understanding code, getting information to make decisions about technical decisions. But what's also talked about in developer productivity circles is the outsized impact of the outer loop, which is more about humans. I attended a session with Plaid's former CTO recently. I remember him saying something yeah, you can cut down your CI/CD times by X percentage, but it takes you 3 weeks to make a decision about a product decision. It's not really moving the needle. And I think that really explains the gap we see between these like the control, like the impact on coding is definitely tangible.
Yeah.
Yet we at the organizational level we don't see, like, we're seeing 10% productivity. So like, how do you reconcile that? And I think the outer loop friction points explain a lot of that, right? Like you're not eliminating the human bottlenecks in software development, which often make up like the majority of the friction.
Yeah. Any early sort of thinking around how that needs to change more broadly?
Yeah, well,
either with tools or just from the way people organize themselves.
Yeah, I think, I've seen some tools that look promising for this, but I think as one of the previous speakers talked about, this kind of like idea of, look, in the future the developer is going to essentially become a manager of a team of agents, right? I think like I share that sort of prediction in view of the world, but I think what's really interesting about that is like when you think about, okay, all these engineers are going to become managers. Well, if you think it's hard to hire good engineers, like engineering management is probably one of like the most afflicted and like out of like not well executed functions. So like getting all our engineers to be really good managers is actually that's a really difficult like shift to make. And I think that's a big opportunity. That's something I think organizations need to be thinking about is how do you do that? And I've seen some pretty neat tools to help with that as well.
Yeah, and I guess like the Cloud Code and Devin and things like this are rapidly also starting to be talked about and used. And I guess with those type of environments and tools, you need to change the way you organize your work and execute on that.
Yeah, and we see, one of the trends we see, like, I think junior engineers exhibit like higher levels of utilizing things like tab completion or chat for like code generation. But we see senior engineers having more success with some of these newer agentic tools.
Really?
Right? And like that actually makes sense because these agentic tools require you to essentially be a manager and like operate at a higher level of abstraction.
Yeah.
And like there's this kind of narrative around like the death of the junior engineer. And I think, it's I don't know what's going to happen, but it's interesting because on one hand, yes, if senior engineers can essentially delegate their work to agents, there's a lesser need for junior engineers. Yeah. At the same time, if junior engineers can be more effective, thanks to AI, then their stock value goes up. Totally. And so it's hard to tell what's going to happen.
Totally. Any parting words of wisdom, given maybe the top-down pressure that some of these people might be facing? How should they go about, making both a impact in their organization, but also managing, I guess, what we're all feeling right now?
So Microsoft, they haven't published a study yet, but they found like one of the biggest barriers to AI adoption for developers is not the fear of being replaced. Yeah. It's actually skepticism of the hype. And so, being able to like lead with real data from your organization on the benefits being seen in a really concrete way, I think is a really good way to promote, encourage usage. And I would say the other most important thing is just giving folks time, right? And that needs to come from like executive leadership that
you have to carve out the time.
You have to carve out the time because if someone has a deadline to hit every Friday, like they're not going to like spend time learning a new tool. They have to just get the job done, right? So we need to carve out time.
Very cool. I think that's what we had time for, but I encourage you all to check out Abhi's podcast. It's super, super informative. Probably highly applicable to most of the people in this room as far as like thinking about this, scaling this, and learning from the people on the front line. Thank you.
Thank you.